Hello and welcome to the Postmodern Conservative Podcast. I'm your host, Titus, and today on PoMoCon, I have the great pleasure of interviewing for the first time a lady I have long read, one of the most famous intellectual and political polemicists, pugilists, champions, really, we have on the right, and that is Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute in this capacity as political commentator and City Journal, of course. But we have read in many other places at PoMoCon, and given our right-wing cultural interests, this is somehow um, a fitting addition to the series of concerns. We don't usually talk politics. We tend to do more cultural, intellectual, occasionally philosophical things. But the elections have come. The elections have shown a great shift to the right. The electorate turned by significant numbers of points right in 49 states at this point, and in fact, also in DC. So it's a rare opportunity to talk about a right-wing shift in California, a revolt to some extent in the California elections against the craziest parts of this entrenched left-wing ideology. But before we get to that, Heather, thank you very much for joining us, and please introduce yourself to the PoMoCon audience, since it's your first time on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Titus, and it's a great honor. I'm a writer, I'm a journalist. I was an academic monkey. I had long aspired to be a professor of comparative literature. Got very disillusioned with the field, ended up with a tour through law school simply because I was interested in legal theory and how you read constitutional legal texts. I didn't really ever aspire to become a lawyer, but then ended up in New York in the 1990s during the great era of Rudolph Giuliani, when he saved the city with a extremely coherent philosophy of urban governance and urban life, with an emphasis on personal responsibility, on safe streets, on clean streets, on pushing back on the massive welfare state that had taken over, a huge segment of both the population and government spending. So that was my introduction to doing on-the-ground reporting. And I've just, since then, there's been so much to catch up on. I was there at the start of the anti-police movement, when in the 90s you had the whole driving while black insanity that, as usual, ignored the issue of, well, who's committing the traffic offenses, who's speeding. The NYPD became a target of left-wing agitation led by Al Sharpton and others. And so since then, I've written a lot about crime, policing, education, but above all, culture. And, you initially distinguished politics and culture, Titus, but I know that was merely a sort of a statement on the way to the future, because at the end, you did acknowledge that politics really is about these culture issues. And I would say, when it comes to California and its start of a very, very overdue turnaround on crime among the voters, what is going on with our criminal justice system, what has been going on with the massive deprosecution, decriminalization, refusal to prosecute crime, is very much a cultural issue. The reason that you've seen these progressive prosecutors across the country, up and down California, in Chicago, in New York, in Philadelphia, in New Orleans, in Boston, is not overtly declare that we are not going to prosecute entire categories of crime, whether it's shoplifting, theft, disorderly conduct, even resisting arrest, which is the end of civilization. If a prosecutor sends a message that you can resist arrest, a lawful arrest, or a cop's lawful authority, and there will be no consequences, you have now declared that we are living in an anarchic state. Well, the reason for all of this decriminalization and deprosecution is the idea that the criminal justice system is pervaded by racism. And the reason they arrive at that idea is that if you neutrally, constitutionally, lawfully enforce the criminal law, you will inevitably have a disparate impact on Black criminals. We do have a racially disproportionate prison population in the US. Blacks are about 13% of the nation's population. They make up about a third of the nation's prisoners in both state and federal prisons combined. The left looks at that disparity and says, well, look, Blacks are incarcerated at about 3 times the rate of their population. The only allowable explanation for that is racist cops, racist prosecutors, racist judges, racist laws, racist drug laws, racist juries. No, that is the sleight of hand that all of your viewers, Titus, must be on guard against. The proper benchmark for measuring that 30%, 33% Black population in our prisons is not demographic percentages in the population. It's who's committing the crime. And sadly, and this is difficult territory to talk about, Titus, it's ordinarily racial etiquette would counsel against it. But given that the left is tearing down every institution in the name of racism based on a completely phony charge, sorry, we've got to give the facts in return. And Blacks nationally in the 75 largest counties commit about 60% of all violent crime in those 75 largest counties, even though they're 15% of the population in those counties. In Los Angeles, which we'll talk about later, Blacks are 57 times more likely to commit homicide than whites, according to the victims, witnesses of those homicides, not the victims. They're about 30 times more likely to commit robbery than whites based on the victim identifications. These disparities are ubiquitous. Since the George Floyd race psychosis, since the mass riots of the George Floyd phony narrative, Black juveniles are 100 times more likely to be shot than white juveniles. Every single day, there are barbaric, insane, incomprehensible drive-by shootings going on in Black communities that nobody talks about. They don't talk about. And who's shooting those Black juveniles at 100 times the rate? Other Blacks, not the cops, not the whites. So anyway, culture is politics. The cultural idea that the United States remains defined by white supremacy and that any racial disparity, whether it's in education, the Google tech workforce, an Alzheimer's research lab, partners at an elite law firm, if there is not 13% Black representation, the only allowable explanation for that is racism. That is wrong. The
Yeah,
explanation for
exactly.
ongoing
This is the core issue that, as you said, starting out, in a certain way, we're living through an inkling of the crime waves of the last ones, I guess, were the late 80s, early 90s.
Right.
And since things have gotten so much better, but if one aspect of things has gotten a lot worse, since now it seems like crime is driven by elites, by elite ideology, by elite misgovernance. As you say, this is a culture issue, because whatever it is people are willing to say, claim, defend, campaign on, money behind, in the case of the famous Soros prosecutors, DAs, etc., all of these things have a massive effect on policy that most people, electorates, but also broadly speaking, Republicans as politicians, as parties, didn't see coming. Everybody, even since, I guess, 2014 or so, when these crazy things started, the Ferguson effect, as it's sometimes called, after the peculiar riots in Missouri, peculiar at the time, since much more horrifying, of course, as you said, 2020s, cities on fire. Uh, the liberal utopias like Portland, Oregon, burning night after night for 3 months or something, federal buildings on fire. But that, as you say, it's a dissolution of state authority mandated from within the state, at least helped along by the state, excused by the state. Crazy things are happening in this country that people are not yet aware of. Where they stand on these issues is a somewhat different matter. Although, where do you stand on issues like, do people deserve to be set on fire? Do people deserve to have their property destroyed? No, everybody has a right to liberty of person and safety and property. Okay, that's what the constitutional arrangement is all about. And yet there's this more basic question: do people even know how many Americans have heard the wife of the governor of Minnesota, who was about to become a vice president supposedly of America, talk about how she enjoyed the horrors of the George Floyd riots? Said that she opened the gubernatorial mansion window and smelled the fire of tires and was excited about what that means. Everybody has to feel the suffering. Everybody has to. That's a crazy lady. She should be nowhere near any gubernatorial office. She should be nowhere near any public power. But there's a lot of people like that. They are really in favor of the crime. Partly America got too nice. People got restless, crazy. They want excitement. Partly, clearly, there's something in liberal politeness that led to a bad conscience and eventually to an abandonment of constitutional authority as much as of competence. And so you have these situations where all the ordinary officials, like policemen, are not only hamstrung, but in a way shocked. They have no idea what is going on. Why is the DA on the side of the criminal programmatically, openly, to the point of politicians changing laws not to prosecute theft? All of these institutional changes come from cultural changes, but nobody saw it coming, especially not the ordinary guy. How do you explain to the ordinary American what you see on the front page of the New York Post today, that a guy who looks like a killer for a cartel, at any rate, what is known is that he was caught with an AR-15 and he's an illegal alien, was released from arrest in New York City. What was he arrested for? Exactly what you were talking about. He assaulted a police officer. What is that police officer supposed to think? What are all the others supposed to think? These are serious people. They understand what a loaded weapon means. And if that guy gets released, then why would you be taking chances with your life the next time? This is the sort of terrible policy that we've seen over the last decade, but accelerated, as you see, over the last 4 years, that is forcing people to choose where they are on these basic issues. We used to think policy is somehow negotiable and adjusted for what works in what circumstances, but there's a deeper political level that we tend to call culture. That means, do we even have agreements on things like civil tranquility, on law and order? Do we have agreements that lawful citizens are to be preferred to criminals who attack them? And that's no longer something that you can have cross-partisan agreement on. And so we end up disputing these things in elections or in the media and on this podcast, because somehow we are not getting the kind of political leadership we need.
Well, I agree with everything you said, Titus, except one thing, and that's probably not even worth contesting at this point, because thank heaven this is behind us. But that issue of Tim Walz's wife saying that about opening the windows during the George Floyd race riots was a big conservative talking point right after she was nominated. I actually think there's a more innocuous interpretation of that statement, which was simply, I don't want to close the window and retreat to my world and pretend this isn't happening. This is a sort of a useful wake-up call. It's not that I'm enjoying it. And frankly, if she had said, when I smell the tires burning and the stores burning and the glass being shattered, I shut my windows tight and hermetically seal them so I don't have to smell it, conservatives would jump on her as well. So, but anyway, Walz, thank heavens, is behind us. The feeling the joy is behind us. The having to listen to the cackle is behind us. This is what I'm grateful for Thanksgiving, is we no longer need to hear that laugh. Everything else, I agree with you, and I would say there is an answer. First of all, let me just restate what you said, which is that we are living through willed decline. This is all our urban problems are the result of policy decisions. They are not inevitable. They are the result of a decision not to enforce the law. The vagrancy problems that cities are seeing, the squalor. We didn't used to have this. This is not the result of housing policy. It's not the result of cruel, inadequate welfare transfer payments. It is the result of deciding to allow a privileged category of people to colonize public space. It doesn't have to happen. And that's certainly true with crime. We learned in New York City in the 1990s that you can bring crime down 80%. This was never understood. It used to be that the FBI would publish annual disclaimers when it published its annual crime reports called the Uniform Crime Reports, or UCRs. It would publish an annual disclaimer saying, well, as we all know, homicide is something that's outside the control of the police. It's a result of poverty and an income inequality. Well, when Mayor Giuliani came in and brought in William Bratton, they said, no, we are responsible. We are the police. We're responsible for public safety. We are going to lower crime. We set benchmarks to lower it, and they met the benchmarks and overcome them. So we learned how to do it in the 1990s in New York. We could do it again. But the reason we have not, the reason that we have made policy choices that make crime inevitable, and again, I hate to be a broken record, but everything comes down to race. If there were not those racial disparities that I spoke about, with Blacks, a third of the prison population, despite being a 13% of the nation's population, we would not be unwinding the criminal justice system. The response would be lock up the criminal and throw away the key. You mentioned we're too nice, we're sort of guilty. That's true. We have gone from being actual white supremacists. Americans were white supremacists. They treated Blacks with gratuitous cruelty for most of America's history. And we are understandably guilty about that. But we have done a 180-degree turn. And now the reality is Black privilege, not white privilege. I'll believe in Black privilege, rather in white privilege, when I hear about a Black college student putting his race down as white, rather a Black high school student who's applying to college, putting his race down as white because he thinks that's going to confer an advantage on him getting into college admissions. There is no such Black student, or if he is, he's literally certifiably insane, because being Black confers enormous advantages, not just getting into college, but getting into law school, medical school, business school, getting hired at a law firm, getting hired at a bank, getting hired at a newspaper, getting hired at a corporation. That is our reality today. But we are now terrified of the behavioral, the criminal gaps. We're terrified of the academic skills gaps. And Western civilization, America and Western civilization more generally, would rather blame itself for phantom racism than look honestly and without turning their eyes away at the problems in inner city cultures, whether it's the immigrant Muslim cultures in Western Europe, which are destroying the civilization there and importing vast amounts of anti-Semitism, ironically, into Germany, which has made support for Israel, it's part of its very constitution. And yet Germany and the rest of Europe, until very recently, would rather have open borders and bring people that are fundamentally opposed to their liberal elite values in than say, no, we have a right to protect our country, our countries and our culture. And in the United States, we are unwilling to say that the problems in the Black community are due to a very pathological culture and family breakdown.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And the fact that things have gotten recently measurably worse, for better and for worse, we live in an Enlightenment society. And so the state collects a lot of data. And we know what happened in 2020 or 21 or 22 with crime. It shot up shockingly. Not just homicides or other kinds of crime that we sort of think might lead to death. It's traffic deaths. Those shot up tremendously as well. And nobody would think to look for that, or most people at any rate would. These kinds of sudden changes reveal that these are changeable phenomena. They are not a fate. They are not, cosmic nature, like the motion of the stars or the expansion of the universe. What we're talking about culture and policy, about choices and consequences. And and the problem, I think, even for people on the right, again, bad conscience about race is one of them, one of the problems or one aspect of it, and the most obvious, I would say, the elephant in the room, as we used to say. But there's another thing. There's a certain weakness, a certain unwillingness to defend civilization. You could say that we have gone from politeness to tolerance to acceptance to affirmation to a point where it's not clear that anybody can say no in any regard. It's not clear that anybody can play defense in any aspect of association, in public life, in private life, whatever. It's people are tempted to a certain extent to give up on civilization. And reading you on the cities and listening to you now, a certain thought came to me that people who used to have too much money for their own good would do something like build the Statue of Liberty and ship it to America. What a grand gesture! This was industrialization, it was enlightenment, it was progress. Those Victorian years, as they were, the Gilded Age in America, people would start building, all of the everything from the Met to the Everyman libraries or the Carnegie endowments, various kinds of public projects. Luxury was often more tasteful, more useful, somehow pro-social. Luxury in the cities of America in the 21st century, as opposed to, say, the turn of the 19th century, is the encampments. Luxury is the horrible crime. It's a new, weird way of dealing with having too much money for your own good. In society, because of tech, we talk of zero interest rate phenomena. The sort of things that people get up to, the kinds of fake investments or fake industries that sprout once people think that, there's magic money out there. There's a correlative of that, the social phenomena, the cultural phenomena, when people stop thinking there are consequences.
Well,
People go too far.
yeah, that's a very interesting concept that luxury now consists in justifying, tolerating, turning your eyes away from dysfunction and urban squalor. Now, one has to add, of course, that by and large, the people who are responsible for voting in those policies and giving them ideological legitimacy can insulate themselves from those policies, so they both support them and don't live completely with them on the doorstep. Not exclusively. I mean, there's still lots of leftist bohemian Antifa types that are living in neighborhoods like the Lower East Side in New York that have the vagrants on their doorstep, unlike the leftists who live in San Francisco's, by the ocean and the promontories and the heights there that vote these policies in, but basically are in their compounds. But that's a very interesting redefinition of luxury. And as far as the people not willing to support civilization or rules, of course, they do want rules for people that they think are backwards and have a whole enormous set of rules. But by and large, you're absolutely right. And this, to me, is the issue I've been thinking about the most obsessively for the last several months, and will continue to do so, which is, what is it about Western civilization that makes it unique among all civilizations, both historically and at the present time, in turning on itself with such vengeance? It is the only civilization that declares its most profound and glorious accomplishments above all the scientific method, the conquest of penury, of want, of early childhood death, of maternal mortality, of human beings living in the most impossibly poor conditions. We turn on ourselves and declare science racist, we declare math racist, we declare biology racist, we declare objectivity, ambition, a belief in quality, in striving for perfection. All of those things are racist. No other culture does that. We say, we endlessly flagellate ourselves for colonialism or for slavery. There is not a single people a single culture, a single civilization that has not practiced slavery. It has been the human condition, what human beings do to each other as soon as they have the opportunity. Up through the 19th century, the only civilization that started a movement against it was Western civilization, beginning in Britain. Britain spent 13% of its naval resources blockading the coast of West Africa because the Africans were still so gung-ho on trading in slaves. Britain occupied Lagos in the 1860s to try and decouple the slave trade there. So we have nothing to apologize for unless the rest of the world apologizes for itself. I keep waiting for Nigerians to apologize for their involvement in the slave trade. I keep waiting for Japan to apologize for the Bataan Death March, for tribal genocide that's gone on everywhere. We are the only culture that is involved in this perverse self-annihilation, which is now, of course, being carried out demographically with this belief that we have no right to say we want to preserve our cultures. We cannot limit the mass migration of people from the third world. That is the issue of the 21st century, is mass migration from the global south to the Western civilized world north. If that goes on unchecked, everything is going to fall apart completely.
Yeah, I think we are undergoing a practical test of enlightenment. To what extent is self-criticism part of self-improvement? To what
Exactly.
extent does self-criticism turn merely into pathology?
Right.
And then so in a way the highest in our civilization is not that we can brag about it, but that we can participate in it, that we can self-improve. But that too can be travestied and then turned into this pathological self-destruction. You can end up with an incredibly sophisticated barbarism, that a barbarism that apes civilization. There's so I think the most brutal of the Shakespeare tragedies, Titus Andronicus, involves this. You see these savages getting into the Roman Empire up the top. They're involved with the mistress of the emperor, and they're reading Greek myths, the myth of Philomela and Procne, and who are Greek, and Thracian Tereus. There's an entire horror in that story, and they get ideas about how to rape and torture the daughter of the general Titus Andronicus. That is some kind of use of civilization, but it's not the right use of civilization. It's some kind of use of sophistication or reading or enlightenment in that context, but it's clearly monstrous. And Shakespeare moves on to point out that also there's something weird about these Romans. Titus Andronicus is clearly a great man, but his first gesture on proving how Roman he is on his return victorious to Rome is to demand human sacrifices. And if you read the other Shakespeare Roman plays and poems, this never featured in Rome before. Something inside of Rome is also quite rotten, as we see, of course, with the fratricidal emperor. So I think, somehow we're undergoing this a similar test of civilization, of our Enlightenment civilization. Are people taking seriously the discipline required for science and trying to figure out to the best we can how to arrange our affairs? Or are these merely excuses and then at the same time instruments to wield power? All the crazy people who demand reparations for racism, their ideas of scholarship are horrifying, but their grasp of federal contracting monies for DEI is astute.
Mhm.
We are in this weird situation where people who are decent tend to be clueless, but a lot of the horrible people who are criminals, who engage in unconstitutional political activity from within the bureaucracy, for example, those people are quite astute. People who get DAs elected who stop prosecuting crime, they are astute, but of course they are crazy. So we could say that there's one problem, if you were to speak more philosophically about the Enlightenment, is there any such thing as evil? What do you do when you run into it? As decent people, we're powerless to stop evil when it comes in a political form. But on the other hand, there's something in our elites that makes them say there's no such thing as evil. They're just misunderstood, maladjusted people to be treated with the right institutional solutions that then will fix it. To some extent, there are people who bring on the end of civilization as in order to prove that there's no evil. These criminals, these crazy people, men who want to beat up women with the full approval of the elite in sports, those people used to be called evil. I've noticed this in the vocabulary of intelligent Americans, that what our grandfathers would have called wicked or unjust or evil or bad or right, now people just call absurd. Oh, this terrible crime happened. It's so absurd. Absurd is not the right way to characterize what's going on in our situation. We often see evil things and laugh at it. It's like we can't believe it, so to speak. But I think we also somehow can't deal with it. We assume that it's not real at some level or won't affect us. There aren't consequences. There's a kind of inability on our part and the unwillingness on the part of the sorts of elites who are captured by this elite ideological madness, and that we are inept. They are, if astute, committed to very evil projects. And of course, this notion that everybody gets to decide what it means to be American, except the Americans who should have no opinions on the border. Everybody gets to decide what it means to be European or French, except the Frenchmen and the Europeans. That is madness writ large. But the obviousness of it does not stop people from embracing it or proclaiming it. So it's clear that we need a culture war. We already have a culture war, but not exactly the one we need. We would need one where we turn Enlightenment scrutiny back to self-improvement and put limits on the kind of elite production that creates pathological cases, people who want to hate us. Since we started with literature, I think like you. I grew up loving literature and thinking that this could be a wonderful way to learn about our civilization. But it dawned on me at some point in college that if you want to make sure you run into a club of people who hate Shakespeare, the first place you would go is the English department. If you want to run into a club of people who all hate George Washington, the first place you'd go is the history department. So that, I think, shows this thing that I'm talking about, that people won't defend the civilization or its standards. They won't say no. And also that they're not for the sorts of things that we used to consider high-minded and elevating, like what's broadly called culture, but also the benevolent philanthropic transformations of modern life that you talked about. We save so many lives. We allow people so many freedoms to live their lives in so many different ways. We should all, to some extent, be proud of that, but also mindful that we don't have infinite resources, of course, and that there are not infinite choices. Every choice you make will restrain other choices. You see life differently at 30 than at 20 because many choices have been foreclosed. So that's somehow also less obvious to us. It seems like there's a revolt against that reality. You make some choices and then they stick. And so people would rather see institutions destroyed than accept the limits that those institutions impose, that, also just life imposes on us. With the passing of years, you have fewer choices, and you had better have made the right choices, because otherwise the wrong choices, I guess the worst of that is of course, America's terrible drug crisis. Some choices you make, you don't get to walk away from. You don't get to survive, actually. And freedom, therefore, must be better choices. That's why we need civilization. That's why we need enlightenment, because if you make the wrong choices, you run out of choices.
Well, I disagree with your reading of the Roman plays or the Roman sort of homicides and regicides generally as a product of Enlightenment self-criticism. I think that those are the result simply of the brutal ambition for power that people have. When I look for the roots of Western self-annihilation, I agree with you that it is absolutely the instinct that began at least with Platonic philosophy, if not before that, to challenge received wisdom, to challenge authority, to think critically about concepts. Where do they come from? What is justice? You've got certain reflexive understandings. Are they accurate? That, again, is perhaps the signal trait of the West, that kind of self-reflexive scrutiny that resulted in things like the beauty of the scientific method with randomized controlled experiments, blind controlled experiments, and not assuming that received wisdom is correct. And so my question is rather, when did that become so lethal and so self-cannibalizing? Was there a point where you could have stopped on the pendulum swing from healthy self-scrutiny to something that is simply pathological? And the fact is, I think conservatives are rather a bunch of fakes because they pretend to be for, a Burkean respect for tradition, but our present world is the result of so many absolutely radical rejections of tradition and authority that we've forgotten about. I'm listening now to a book by the American historian Gordon Wood on the radical transformations in American identity about equality. And in the 17th century, Americans accepted a very, very hierarchical world where the gentry, it was expected they would not work. It was expected that they would be deferred to. It was a patriarchal culture, and I say that with respect. We need more of that now, as far as I'm concerned. But as an empirical matter, that just describes what was. But more important, it was complete deference to inherited forms of authority. And of course, we all revere Edmund Burke. He was for established religion. He took it for granted that you would have a monarchy. He took it for granted that there would be a class of people who had political authority based simply on their birthright. We've thrown all of that out the window. Our present world has nothing to do with traditions from the 18th century. And yet we now pretend to be in favor of conserving tradition. So, we're all frankly progressives. It's a difficult thing. I don't see conservatives saying remove universal suffrage, go back to property requirements, or even more positive would be remove the vote from females. They contributed mightily to the growth of the welfare state in the 20th century. I mean, I was listening to German radio today, or TV, and they were talking about the renewing or trying to lower the costs of a subsidized train ticket. And it makes me realize, like, what government does in the 20th century is basically redistribute wealth. It's all about expanding a whole bunch of welfare programs. This too never existed. 19th century government ruled, it conducted war, it made treaties, it convened courts, but it wasn't involved in handing money out all the time, which is basically what Western governments do. So anyway, Mike, to bring it back, my question is, when did the self-critical instinct become so destructive? And so you also made some interesting points. Well, again, you say you want to make it positive again, but the question is, yeah, when did it stop being positive? How do you do that? And your point about we are not willing to support high culture and support elitism and a high notion of culture. I read for the first time this summer the most revelatory author I've read in a very long time, the French philosopher Renaud Camus. And he is the author, the first one to use the term the Great Replacement, which has been greatly misunderstood because he never claimed it was an actual deliberate conspiracy. He was just observing the radical demographic changes. And he made a point, which is very much like yours, Titus, which is who gets to define what it means to be French? And, you know, he says these Muslims who came here 2 years ago will say very defiantly on TV, I'm as French as you are, if not more so. And he says, wait a minute, French used to mean a commitment to a 1,000-year history, to our literature, to our philosophy, to the sensible quality of our villages, to our cuisine. That was what it meant to be French. And he talks about two movements. One, the anti-elitism of the petty bourgeoisie who displaced the haute bourgeoisie, and their fanatical passion for equality, which meant they could not accept culture because culture is the transmission of the accomplishments of the dead. It's basically a civilizational, generational transfer that used to involve making unapologetically aesthetic distinctions, that there are certain forms of expression that are higher, more complex, more profound explorations of the human soul than, let's say, our current mindless, melodyless pop music. So he talks about that fear now of being accused of being aristocratic or elitist or snobby or making discriminations. But then he also has a very complicated thing that we need not get into now because we're going so far afield, but he talks about the second career of Adolf Hitler, which is that the actual evil of Hitler has discredited anything remotely associated with him, above all, the idea of nations, of peoples, of races, meaning peoples, of borders, and that is what he would place the civilizational self-destruction, I think, more in the 20th century. I think it goes back earlier. Finally, to your point about evil, we want to give it more reality. I'm not sure about that. It's a theological concept. I'm not sure what it gives you, what it gets you to be able to put the world into a Manichaean category of these people are evil, absent some kind of theological concept of the soul. Let's just be conscious. And this is something that I'm haunted by all the time, that is hard for me to get around, but I'm always flipping the tables, turning the tables on myself. They would say the same about us. I mean, they would say that Trump is evil, that he's a fascist. So I think, I'm not sure what you get by that. I would just sort of, I'd rather stick maybe with their policies are dumb or self-destructive, resulting in destructive of everybody else, than a bright line rule
Well,
of, I don't know,
you
who
know,
gets put in the evil category
I
and
know
who.
what you mean, but think about this: if you don't call, the guy who murders people, and then says, "Look, now I'm transgender. You have to call me she and put me in women's prison." If you can't call that guy evil, then why get so bent out of shape about it? If you use the word destructive, these
Because there's,
policies are destructive, but is destruction good or bad? Because if destruction isn't bad or evil, then why are you against destruction?
well,
Why are
I think,
destructive policies something we avoid? Because they are evil.
well,
So,
I think
but and more experiential, like how about the victims' rights? Like the family of somebody who got murdered, the people who suffer through the terrible crime waves, the people who suffer through the crime wave now. It's not such a bad crime wave as crime waves have gone in the last 60 years, but still, what is the experience of that person who loses loved ones, who lives in fear? What have they experienced? If there's no moral language for that, then there's no justification for policies to stop that.
well, I think we've got a moral language. We've got a moral language of sadism, of hurtfulness, of destructiveness, of infliction of.
Americans don't like those words, right? Nobody in America says, "Oh, these sadists." Who cares? There
Well,
has to be a moral language that has political purchase. After all, it is a democracy. People get to vote. There must be a way for the electorate to be able to call this action such that it's reprehensible, blameworthy. A language of praise and blame is necessary to undergird justice.
Okay. Well,
You
so
somehow distinguish Daniel Penny and the crazy criminal whom he tried to subdue and who later died. Um, we're still sort of willing, some of us, a few, to say Daniel Penny was a hero. He did what, this is a good man, a veteran, a guy who took responsibility to protect all of these people trapped in in a subway car. But if he's a hero, or at least what he did is heroic, protective, good, what would you say is on the other side of that? The other guy's action. What does it mean to instill fear or to terrorize or to victimize people on the subway? To call that sadism, I don't think has any moral value. To say nothing of this, it's just think about the word. It's such a weird academics word derived from this guy's name, who's a writer that nobody reads. Like, it's so postmodern. It has no purchase on reality. It's a reference related to another reference to a literature thing. It's funny in a way. There must be a way that the interior experience and the social experience of the people involved in this suffering can connect to the law, to justice, to a political campaign, to the activities of human beings that we approve of and want more of, disapprove of, want less of, a language of praise and blame, as I was saying.
I agree, but I think evil is a theological concept, and are the people who vote, are the citizens who voted for George Gascon or Alvin Bragg evil? Is Alvin Bragg evil? The ACLU would say that if you vote for Trump, you are evil. If you vote for border control, you are evil because those migrants have a right to go wherever they want. And if they think that they're safer in the United States, they have a right to be here. And they would say that family separation is evil. I agree with you. Daniel Penny is an absolute hero, and he's been vilified because he's a white male and he stands for male virtues of chivalry. And there's of course a huge race element in that. Would I call the Jordan Neely evil? I would call him deranged. I would call him a predator, but completely crazy. I'm not sure I would call him evil. Is a shoplifter evil? In one sense, I agree with you in that anybody who is antisocial, who is entitled, who believes that he can take property at will, and that there is nobody has the right to assert property. If there's something he wants and he doesn't have it, he gets to take it. I think that person is reprehensible, but evil is a very, very strong term. And I
Yes,
just
but
want,
weak terms or very sophisticated terms don't have any political purchase.
how broadly would you cast that net? Is half of the country who voted for Harris evil because she is for trans rights? I agree that trans is the most perverse development in all of human history. Understand what's driving the trans phenomenon, and you will have understood something very important about our current moment. And I'm not sure any of us have gotten to the bottom of this issue, but is anybody who votes for Tim Walz, are they evil? Is Tim Walz evil? I just think that you're playing with a nuclear weapon, and I'm not sure that absent a very clear set of guidelines for who gets in the evil category and who doesn't, that it is so essential to a vocabulary that would allow you to push back against the civilization destroying tendencies that we are now promoting in our elite culture.
So, I think there are three different aspects to your objection that point in somewhat different directions. One of them is the fact that if you use this word against them, they will use it against you. That is that our lives are polemical, at least once we organize. But to some extent, we're divided against ourselves. One can second guess oneself. One has the experience of looking back and thinking, what was I thinking? One has the experience of shame. I did such and such a thing or said such and such a thing, and I'm ashamed of myself. I should have done better. That was not good. Maybe it was, even a wicked thing to do. So we have these kinds of divisions, and we do articulate them polemically, of course. But this is, somehow an academic debate, i.e., you are being called evil, and you will be. You don't get a chance to decide this. Since you have no vote on how your political adversaries describe you, at some point, these sorts of concerns about reciprocity have to be turned upside down. Since your adversaries treat you this way, you must take the kid gloves off. So with the polemical objection, but of course there is this other objection that there is something religious, theological in talk about evil, and this could be, as you said, a nuclear thing. It could turn even our political polemics or our partisanship or our close elections into something perhaps more violent, or at least more decisively morally separate. To some extent, this is like the previous one. If you end up in a situation where people will simply say, for example, on social media that if you voted for Trump, they won't talk to you or date you, or they will not show up at your Thanksgiving dinner or whatever. Again, you don't have a choice anymore. In the real world, these decisions have been made and these moral separations are happening. And of course, they are not unheard of in America. Eventually, in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, people decided very strong moral language and acted on it. Who knows how things will turn out, but these are not really choices. You can describe what people are doing, but not control. And so every decision you make about political language, which has to be in the way you were suggesting, thoughtful, prudential, worrisome of consequences, but it must also take the circumstances into consideration. And the circumstances being what they are, we do not have the choices that we would like to have as decent people. It would be nice to be in a situation where we worry, what if people call Trump Hitler all the time? What does that lead to? But we don't have the luxury of that worry. We have the reality that's being done all the time and will be done. We can only adapt to it, but we cannot choose it. We cannot unchoose it. We have no power over people who say that all the time. Nothing can stop them. You can see the guy face assassination attempts. Nothing can stop people from calling him Hitler. So we're way past your worries, actually. I share them. Somehow they speak, I think, as I said, to, I think, decency, a certain desire that is, if we're more theoretical, to identify the lawful with the just. But that's not the situation we live in. And so we have to think about what is a political language that works in the real situation, not in the situation we wish for. Choice, as Aristotle reminds us, is limited by your circumstances and options. Wish is not. You can wish for another society, but you can't choose it. And so with this question of the danger of the language, to the extent to which it's real, it's again not a matter of choice anymore. But there's, I think, a third issue involved in your objection that has to do with what it means to understand the human phenomena. What makes somebody crazy rather than evil, deranged rather than evil, these kinds of things. And there's something to that. There, you would say, is the deep core of the issue. The people who, some people are more oriented to the moral side of the matter. That is to call somebody like Daniel Penny, say, this guy's a hero, or people who think, Trump surviving an assassination attempt is a revealing moment, his courage. Clearly, the orientation there is towards this moral attachment, this hope, and the fear that makes us need hope. But you could also look at it another way, and as you're suggesting, use a medical language, use a scientific language to talk about derangement, to talk about a medical diagnosis of some kind of mental insanity. But that surely cannot be, whatever our Enlightenment hopes are, that cannot be the political language. If anything, it has led us to what is sometimes called a therapeutic ethic, right? That everything can be talked of in therapeutic terms, and everything that is deranged could be rearranged, and eventually everybody can become a well-adjusted liberal person. But that's not true. Therapy and the sort of medical side of enlightenment, they're much more limited, unfortunately, and are simply unresponsive to the urgency, the day-to-day uncertainty of all of these political happenings. It's precisely because the culture leads to policies, leads to a different life on a day-to-day basis, that one has to deal with those things, with the realities, with people's sentiments about these things, what they will respond to, won't respond to, and
Well, I think
that
we're,
defines what's practical rather
yeah,
than our.
I'm not sure what this conversation is about. At this point, you know, I'm not a moral philosopher, so this topic is sort of unexpected, and I'm improvising here. But I would say, if we're going to still be debating the usefulness of a vigorous use of evil within our political rhetoric, which I'm not sure is that relevant to anything, but if you want to prosecute the conversation, that's fine. Let's look again at what Jordan. So I hope that your viewers know what we're talking about when we speak about Daniel Penny and Jordan Neely. I don't know if there needs to be a brief thumbnail description. This was the black guy that was homeless and deranged and came on a subway in New York City and started acting very strangely and talking about somebody's going to die, and you know, he was clearly in some kind of psychotic moment. Daniel Penny is a former Marine, white guy, very statuesque looking. You know, he embodies the white male wasp, and he brought Jordan Neely, the black vagrant, down in a chokehold, held him down. Some other people helped him hold Neely down, hold his arms and whatnot, one guy being black. And eventually Neely died of some suffocation, and he probably was very high on a very strong form of marijuana. Um, so, so Alvin Bragg, the New York prosecutor, decided to bring a murder case against Daniel Penny, something that, again, looks to me highly racially motivated. But to call Jordan Neely the vagrant that was there, you know, ranting, to call him evil, he didn't hurt any. I mean, I think Penny was absolutely right to do what he did. I think he was a good Samaritan. He should be celebrated for taking danger on himself, because these vagrants, these psychotic, often black people that are walking around like they're right out of an insane asylum, are very, very dangerous. They push people into subways. You don't know what they're doing next. So, no question, you and I are on the same page. Daniel Penny is a hero, but to call Jordan Neely evil, I'm not one for playing the victim card and for saying, you know, don't blame the victim. But one can make a very strong case that Jordan Neely was a product of very, very bad decision making that has decades-long history in New York of deinstitutionalization, of saying we don't want to inhibit the autonomy of mentally ill people, so we're not going to put them in insane asylums. We're going to allow them to walk around the street. We're going to give little pathetic outreach workers, send them, you know, please, would you like a pizza delivered to your cardboard box on the street, and let them go free and free and free. He should have been in confinement. He should not be on the streets, but he was clearly psychotic. So to call him evil, as much as I don't want to, you know, go around saying that people who are antisocial are victims, I just, if that's the ambit of your use of evil, I would say, in answer to your question, what is a political language that works, which is a very important question. If that involves using evil in that promiscuous a term, a mode, I don't think it works very well. I think it's alienating, and it is Manichaean. And you say, well, it's going to be used against you. True, but I would say it's a shortcut to making arguments as to why certain policies are wrong. And I think you can make those arguments without, again, like, how many people would you count as evil? Are the people who voted for Kamala Harris evil?
I don't
Because
think so, but you know, that's political activity organized under the law, right? I mean,
Well, but
I
they
would say that you should think
obviously that's
primarily about criminal activity in relation to evil, not lawful activity, although, you know, these are somewhat more complicated things.
is Alvin Bragg evil?
I think one would say that he is corrupt, and you know, if perhaps the uh, politically right, the American right is a mix of people who are Christians and people who aren't really. Maybe their parents or grandparents or great grandparents were, but I guess most people, especially if they have college today, just aren't Christians. And one thing I'm trying to point out is that it will not be the case that the people with college degrees are going to dictate language to most of the electorate in a democracy. And so it's really going to be more of a fight among the larger electorate, how they talk about these things. And the Christians are more for evil, although they're not very much for it, or there's not strong preference, but everybody else might not be interested. So you could say that as a matter of description, since it's political language, as I said, maybe it doesn't work, who knows? But as a matter of analysis, that doesn't even enter into it. It's not, it's simply irrelevant to the issue. But you know, there used to be another moral language that at some point spoke to Americans to talk about the vices. Some men are vicious. There are, I guess, still remnants of it in Vice Squad or something like that. That's bad choices. Those are things that make you a bad person. I'm not sure there are any bad persons left. I would say certainly Alvin Bragg is a vicious man, both in the ordinary understanding and in the more technical understanding of what it means to be vicious. But I'm not sure that's evil. Again, partly because it's not so much a matter of crime, but it could be that he's usurping legal authority. That is criminal activity. You know, is it misfeasance? Is it malfeasance? There's a distinction there that matters. You know, but will it matter in the more practical side of politics? Maybe it won't, and maybe your choices are much more limited than you realize, because Alvin Bragg will, you know, send the prosecutor into the room who talks about Daniel Penny in the trial, if what I've read in reports is correct, not addressing him, talking about Daniel Penny as the white man. And there's nothing you can do to stop this. There's nothing any of us can do. I'm not saying they will call Trump Hitler. I'm saying they are and have been, that it's not an object of possibility or choice, it's a reality.
But we
And
mock
so,
that.
like, the Manichaeanism is not something we can choose. Like you're saying, should we choose to behave in a Manichaean way? I'm saying that's not a choice.
Yes, it is. I'm sorry, it is. You don't have to do what the other side. I mean, the
Of
conservative
course, you don't have to do it, but that doesn't
argument
change the character of the
adversarial.
fact, because you're still
You
being
think,
called evil. And so the Manichaean language is just there. You can choose not to participate in it,
yeah.
but you cannot choose, say, to reject it. There's no meaningful rejection there. You could say that as a disposition, morally, internally, you wouldn't perhaps speak about your conscience, since that's a religious concept, but some other way that's not religious. But in some way, we can describe interior experience. You reject it, but not practically. There's no practical correlative of that desire or disposition or thought. Practically, we are stuck in a Manichaean system. We're not. That is the meaning ultimately of what we started with, the culture war. Our politics is now a culture war. But since the enemy gets a vote, you know, what can you do? I would say that you could say that here we have, so to speak, some disagreements on a kind of experience in conversation of why on the right we have such problems as we do. It is not possible to, at least not yet, to have some kind of practical agreement and on the one hand, have the political language and the rhetoric. But of course, political language is not just rhetoric, it's also laws, policies, all of these things. They have to somehow be arranged so that from the experience of the voter all the way to the institutional arrangement in a law and the office with various people on staff, that there is a kind of synchronization. It's never perfect, but some kind of synchronization. There must be some kind of agreement, and we're looking for it. And I think we've given evidence that this is a very difficult task indeed, in a way, in the sense in which politics is a noble calling, trying to arrange the human affairs that we all see are so difficult. It's noble precisely because it is so difficult to do. So obviously, we're not going to be able to solve America's problems or civilizations, but we can solve some things, and maybe those things can add up to the extent to which we can face up to things that are somehow surprising, and certainly were not a matter of choice. And I think that's maybe a way to understand the experience of so many people nowadays, even those of us who aren't progressives. That is, we don't believe that the future is going to be better than the past, more or less by default, or the future is going to be the past on present trends. To be a progressive is
I'm
to
not sure
believe that it improves.
what is your argument? I'm just not following. I would say with regards to everybody's going to use it against us, we're going to be called Hitler, so we're already in that world. I guess I do believe that it is important not to have double standards, that if you're going to criticize the left for using the argument ad Hitlerum, and we conservatives mock that, you shouldn't be just as promiscuous in using one's own argument ad Hitlerum and call everybody evil on the other side for,
Sure, that part I completely agree with, but
I
you don't
think
have to call everybody evil.
right. But
Like the
and
questions are not just,
I
do
don't
you
know
want to call everybody evil? The
what
question
is
is
at
also, do you
stake.
want to call anybody evil?
Okay, well,
Right. So like that's a different issue. It's not a question of is everybody evil? The question
well,
is there such a thing? Does that word correspond to a
mhm.
reality? Is it observable? Is it relevant? Is it of any importance in the given context? How do you explain to somebody, that their kids were just killed? Like all these things are now to some extent in the media. Uh, you know, the victims of illegal alien killers. That's not going to be stopped. There's going to be more of that. There must be some way to talk about these things that isn't, clinical sanitizing away the experience of the family or community. So we needn't jump to the everybody universal level all the time. We can simply look at the realities in the press and in the streets that we all have to deal with. And for those things, at that level, practically, there must be some way to speak convincingly about them. That is to say, in a way that preserves the experience and the passion.
okay, well,
Otherwise,
this,
it's not politics anymore.
yeah,
Otherwise,
yeah,
it's
I mean,
academic. That's what I'm arguing.
okay. I would say this is really a very academic discussion because frankly, it's not that prevalent of conservative discourse to call evil. So, we're arguing about something that maybe not have huge amounts of consequences. I would just say, maybe I would agree with you that one can talk about certain outcomes as structurally evil, but to make the argument that certain people are evil in their soul, I just don't know, but I really think that this conversation should be ended because I don't see I'm not sure what's at stake at the moment, unless we can make things a little bit more concrete. So remind me like what this is about. I'm sort of lost the thread.
If I can then very briefly recapitulate, we talked about the issue of crime and how this stuff is connected to policy and its recent sailings. And the question is, what is the moral language that can connect the ordinary experience, the shock people feel when they see a clip online? What do they think they've seen that they are very disturbed? People talk about such clips as disturbing. There's social media regulation around which clips should be blurred, and you'd have to choose after you see a warning.
Okay.
What is the moral and psychological import of that? These are, you know, or in the campaign, of course, there's been talk about illegal immigration in relation to crime. President Trump did quite a bit of that. There were, perhaps you caught the reports out of Aurora, Colorado, about gangs, cartels taking over apartment complexes. More recently, it came up in the interview the vice president to be J.D. Vance had with, I think, a New York Times reporter, Martha Raddatz, said that only a couple of apartment complexes have been taken over by cartels. And Vance stopped there and said, are you listening to yourself? Only a couple? have been taken over, how is that acceptable to the people who live there? So this sort of crime, there's going to be a lot, and there has been a lot of discourse about these things. These are the very salient issues, the crime issue. How do you describe that activity?
Yeah, I just think, again, like flip the tables on yourself. We heard the constant recourse to calling Trump a fascist or a Nazi as absurd, that this is so out of touch with reality. It is inflating things, it is overheating things, it is whipping the liberals up into this froth of insanity. They are misperceiving reality. As ludicrous as we thought that, if conservatives start throwing around evil all the time, that is as inflated a term as it is to call, it's more inflated a term. I mean, it is a more sweeping ontological, theological category than calling somebody a fascist, which is somewhat narrow in its historical scope. But to call your enemies and people you disagree with evil, I think is very, but again, I will concede to you in order to end this topic, because I just don't think it's very fruitful. So
No,
let's
we do not have to agree at all. We can
agree to disagree.
exactly. This is
You
merely a
think
matter. I'm not asking
it
you
would
to
help?
adopt my views.
You
Far
think that
from it. I'm
this
merely
would
trying to
help their
point out
discourse by calling
the
people evil? I
situation.
think they won't.
And then, of course, you needn't call anybody evil. If it's at all reassuring, I don't go around calling half the country evil or Tim Walz or whoever else you suggested I might. I don't. Uh, I don't think it's in that sense the great worry you seem to think it is. So I would say that it's the worry that is overblown.
Okay.
Uh, but of course, we're all going to, I guess, watch the news, see what's going on in politics, and I think be fairly reassured that things are not, in fact, overheating to whatever paroxysm or terrible consequence in this regard. It's on the other hand, the the overall context for this, which I think is a good note to end on, is the civilizational question, the mix of the attempt to understand what we're going through and the attempt to do something about it, what we used to call theory and practice. As you say, in certain ways, it's a very academic question. We're just theorizing, we could almost say. But on the other hand, what we are talking about is not merely academic. The phenomena themselves are very real. So all of these are practical questions, as we said about the especially the crime issue and the policy related to that, and the ways in which some of these things are changing. As you said, there have been DAs elected, but some also recalled. There have been the mayor of San Francisco lost a re-election, and in Oakland, across the bay, the mayor was recalled. So there are some attempts to change policy to correct course on the crime issue and every other of the things you mentioned. Homelessness, obviously, the encampments. Maybe city life can become more bearable, and as we used to say, from city more civilized. And but the how we can build on these things, what extent they are the beginning of a trend or a one-off, none of these things are obvious now. It could have been that Trump's 2016 election was a one-off, but now it turns out it's not. But maybe it's a two-off, one could say. But maybe it's a trend, and these things cannot be known. We can only guess at them in our somewhat academic way in this broader civilizational context, and hopefully we shall learn more once Trump is inaugurated. And in due time, I'm sure we'll have the chance to have other academic disagreements. So, but for the meanwhile, let's close, and let me thank you very much for the conversation. It was inspiriting.
Yes, I
So
was expecting to talk about Pamela Price and George Gascon being recalled in California, but it certainly took a weird
but
direction. but
We
I'm
gave
happy.
more time to Renaud Camus and to philosophy instead, but I think that's not a bad thing altogether.
Well, we'll hope your listeners agree. I don't know. It's a tough going, but we'll hope.
Uh, all right, Heather, thanks very much and all the best until next time.
Thank you so much, Titus.